wanted to just start by, by saying a little bit about actually my connection to JD, because it sort of inspired the work that I do now. But quite a while ago, was a master's student at the University of Texas in Austin, and at that time, I got really interested in, it was the 90s, the religious right had a great deal of political power, and I was moving from California to Texas, and I had hooked up with a group, a tiny think tank in California called the Institute for Study of the Religious Right, and they started sending me to religious right gatherings so that I could just sort of be in that space and make notes, and I didn't know that was called ethnography at the time, but I got really into it. And so when I was doing my master's thesis, I started going to hang out with the Christian Coalition and focus on the family in Texas and Colorado. And I just, became really, really intrigued with the nature of the appeal of those movements for the people that are the grassroots power inside them. So how do the rhetorics that go on in those spaces translate into grassroots organizing and political momentum? So I became kind of obsessed with the right, and then very interested in like George Lakoff's work in terms of what are the conceptual building blocks of the religious right, religious conservatives, and also of the left. So I had always kind of wanted to be a professional activist, for lack of a better word, when I grew up. So when I went back to San Francisco after Texas, and I had this master's degree in media studies, and I was trying to rent an apartment in San Francisco, and it wasn't, having an MA in media studies wasn't as impressive as I thought it would be, and I had to actually get my sister to co-sign a lease, my sister the lawyer, to co-sign a lease for me. But to say the least, though, I was looking for work, and to make a long story short, I kind of got into this business of basically using public relations for the benefit of trying to turn progressive ideas into public policy. And so I started working for labor unions, and the name of the game was how do we use the mass media system, really, and media that we create to get workers' voices into the media, to try to influence the dialogue. And how do we find the right messengers and the right messages to sort of influence the dialogue and build power at the grassroots level, and also influence opinion leaders. So that's my work on a very pragmatic kind of level. And I've been doing that with a whole mess of different, as a staff person, as a consultant, for labor unions, for feminist funders, and for NGOs for about 10 years now. And so I'm here to talk about the ACLU. I'm the communications director for the American Civil Liberties Union of Northern California, which is the largest ACLU affiliate in the country. It's not the national ACLU in New York. It's the Northern California affiliate. So we cover all of the Northern California counties, and we have 50,000 members. We're an organization supported by membership dollars. So we do get some money from philanthropic foundations, which is important for our work. We're not dependent upon that funding. More than 60% of our funding comes from individual donors, individuals. Anyway, so, but I do want to talk today about, especially because of, just being on a panel that has to do with surveillance and free speech, privacy, and abuses of government power, about the level, the ACLU's work at the national level around all these interesting issues. But I'm going to do that from the perspective of, like I said, strategic communications, which is the sort of pragmatic approach of how do we use mainstream media and alternative media and new media to try to target the audiences that we need to target in order to move a given policy agenda. So, a tiny bit of background about the ACLU. The National ACLU was founded in 1920 out of the desire to defend conscientious objectors during World War I. And the ACLU that I work for was born in 1934 out of a dock workers' strike in San Francisco, in which there was a general strike, and the governor called in the National Guard, and 2 people were killed. And then out of that came these vigilante actions against the dock workers, the strikers. And so the ACLU came in to defend against the kind of wholesale abuses, police abuses at that time. The ACLU was formed. And of course, our general, in terms of the discourse at this conference, we're certainly stuck in an individual rights kind of paradigm. What we do is defend rights according to the Bill of Rights. So sort of the source of authority is the U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And I have Bill of Rights bookmarks for all of you in English and Spanish, should you want one. In case you never know when you might need the text of the Bill of Rights. So anyway, so our work is to defend individual civil liberties. And we're sort of most known for guarding against government abuses of power. In my affiliate is also known for our role in the Japanese internment cases during World War II. So challenging the internment of the Japanese, and also fighting the loyalty oaths in California during the McCarthy era, during the 1950s, which are still in the books. And then things like defending the right of Lawrence Ferlinghetti to sell the book Howl, for example, to sell Allen Ginsberg's book, and for the City Rights bookstore to be able to exist. And then, of course, the free speech movement in the 1960s. And I would say in recent decades, in addition to focusing on freedom of speech and against government abuses of power, we do a lot of work on voting rights, the rights of immigrants, an array of work that's called racial justice that incorporates a lot of different kinds of things, and police abuse work, that kind of thing. So so our general kind of approach, people associate the ACLU with litigation as a primary strategy through the courts, but we also do organizing, meaning that we have to mobilize people in communities, sometimes for new battles, a lot of times for old battles that have been fought before. So we just worked very hard to defeat an initiative in California called Proposition 4, which was the 3rd parental notification initiative in 4 years. And that's, in case you don't know, it's would have required teens to get permission from their parents in order to have an abortion, and would have required physicians to contact parents, and it brought law enforcement into the mix, and it was just a big scary thing. So we're forced to pour a lot of energy into that kind of work. And so we do litigation, we do organizing, we do legislation. A lot of legislation is like behind the scenes. A lot of what we do is preventing bad bills in California, bad anti-immigrant bills, from seeing the light of day. And occasionally we pass good bills. And then, so our budget is we're about an $8 million organization, and we have, in terms of the political economy of our group, we have a staff of 50, and we have 12 people that their entire job is to keep raising money. We have a development department that's 12 people. So there's a lot of work that goes on to regenerate our ability to do this work. Okay, so a couple of things I wanted to say about our work at the national level in relationship to national security. I wanted to tell you about a couple of different cases. Well, actually, first I'll tell you a little bit about probably the most, the ACLU since 9/11 has been, as you can imagine, inundated with complaints, lawsuits. We've brought, a huge number of lawsuits at the national level and in all the states to take on issues of surveillance and racial profiling and suppression of dissent. and all these important issues that I'm sure you're very familiar with. The kind of silver lining, I guess, is that on a popular level, so many people became so aware of these abuses that they joined the ACLU. So our membership has doubled since 9/11. That means our budget's doubled. So we've been able to, we have a staff of 50 now. We had a staff of 20 just 5 years ago. So that's the same thing's true at the national level. So there are 500 people working for the ACLU at the national level, whereas before there were half that. So, there is no silver lining to 9/11, but in ACLU terms, I find, there's a lot of inspiration that I feel from people that just decide to step up and become members, new level of sort of activism. Anyway, so one of the sort of practical kind of communications campaign things that the ACLU has undertaken recently in relation to 9/11 is the work around Guantanamo. So it's like we instead of just sort of, when the military commissions trials were happening in Guantanamo, at the National ACLU, they decided to take a really active approach to, well, how can we don't want these like trials to just fly by and to be perceived as legitimate by the American public. So how can we intervene? What can we do to try to influence that? And so the National ACLU created something called the John Adams Project, which was to go and recruit attorneys from around the country that agreed to defend detainees at Guantanamo. And a very impressive list of folks. And then to do some other things like to solicit statements that were signed by people who were in effective, like powerful insiders, many of them, or symbolically powerful, who could step up and say basically that the trials at Guantanamo, are, such a miscarriage of justice that they're really not to be taken seriously. And another part of that was with the 9/11, the victims' families. There was a lot of play in the press that seemed to kind of feed into the just sort of like typical non-critical kind of reporting about 9/11 and about the trials and the detainees. And so the ACLU went out and it's typical, found 31 family members who had something really important to say but whose voices weren't being heard. And so then the job becomes, well, how do we take this roster of attorneys and of experts and of victims' family members and really give them their day in the media? And so that's kind of where the hard work comes in. And the reason I'm bringing this up, and I want to read you a couple of things from the statements and everything, is that, it's an example of sort of, instead of kind of like a constructive intervention in trying to disrupt kind of business as usual and using mass media and the blogosphere and things to try to do that. And so I'll just read you an excerpt from the 9/11 family members. It's from a press release that says, 9/11 family members challenge legitimacy of Guantanamo military commissions. We believe that the secretive and unconstitutional nature of these proceedings deprive us of the right to know the full truth about what happened on 9/11. These prosecutions have been politically motivated from the start, are designed to ensure quick convictions at the expense of due process and transparency, and are structured to prevent the revelation of abusive interrogations and torture engaged in by the U.S. government. That kind of sort of says it all. So then it was a matter of sort of getting these folks, getting them into the media and trying to counter the coverage. And, we feel like we really did have some impact in terms of kind of slowing the process down, of getting people to look at the military commissions and sort of wrestle with kind of the complete inadequacy of defense counsel in Guantanamo, and sort of like, keeping people who had become sort of numbed by all the abuses under the Bush administration kind of awake and alive and tuning in and turning on to what was going on in Guantanamo. So in terms of the statements that were part of this John Adams Project, part of this campaign, Jimmy Carter, Janet Reno, retired admirals, the wives of people who died during 9/11: William Webster, the chairman of Homeland Security, of the Homeland Security Council, Larry Wilkerson, former chief of staff to Colin Powell. All these people coming out to say we support what the ACLU is doing in terms of trying to leverage due process for these detainees. There's a professor at Yale whose husband was killed in 9/11 who said, "There is compelling evidence that anything that inflames anti-American sentiment makes us less secure. As a matter of national security, then we should close Guantanamo Bay Detention Center." It's part of it. It's interesting because the ACLU, we try to turn that not just into like a media opportunity, but to a sort of an online campaign that we've had to close Gitmo, and then to remain sort of reminding kind of gracefully. We had a national newspaper ad campaign just before Obama took office to remind him of the promises he made about closing Gitmo before he was elected, and to do that in a way that's very respectful and graceful, and at the same time, is it oppositional or is it affirmative? I don't know. It depends. We don't know exactly the way things are going to go with the Obama administration, so we're kind of doing this delicate dance of sort of holding their feet to the fire and staying true to principle, which is very natural for the ACLU. So I'll just tell you very briefly about a couple of national security-related cases that we have that I think are really interesting, too, in terms of Nadia's talk. So one of them, and this is sort of like good news and bad news. We have ACLU Northern California, we have a lawsuit against a company called Jeppesen Data Plan, Inc., which collaborated with the CIA in extraordinary rendition. Our case is on behalf of 5 men that were captured, deported, and tortured. And basically, our struggle has been to try to get the courts to hear these cases. And so basically, they have refused to do so on the grounds that if the case were to be heard before the court, that state secrets would be revealed. And then we have to say everyone knows about extraordinary rendition. It's been written about everywhere. There's no secret about it, and there's a great deal of evidence that deserves to be heard. But we're not having, we're not doing that well with this case. So we just had a hearing. We just had a hearing in federal court after the Eric Holder's administration was in place, in which the judge asked the attorneys from the Justice Department whether they had reconsidered the terms of their argument in light of the transition of the administration. And according to our lead attorney who was in the room, the answer was no. So we're just not sure that this case is going to see the light of day. We had another case that's a little bit more, I guess, then the other depressing one is our suit against the telecommunications companies. It started out with AT&T and Verizon for domestic wiretapping. So all of the people that may have had the hundreds of thousands of cell phone customers who may have had their communications monitored by the telecom companies. There are cases that have been pending in the courts for some time now to try again to have those cases heard before the courts to win justice for cell phone customers. And basically, what's happened, and I'm sure you probably have heard about this, but Congress has endeavored to grant wholesale immunity to the telecom companies. If you've ever heard the phrase Telecom Immunity. And that was unfortunately part of the provisions in the battle over the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, the FISA, amendments to FISA that passed at the end of 2008. So it's a very interesting case. Some of the plaintiffs in that case were like Studs Terkel was a plaintiff. There were journalists and even psychiatrists. I mean, people who have to maintain confidentiality in their telephone communications in order to function professionally. But in any case, that's another case so we're trying to keep the case alive and filing an appeal, but I don't know what's going to go on with that. Okay, so, and I'll just read one of the findings from the last hearing. the effect of the new immunity law is to dispense with this judicial gatekeeping and instead to substitute the opinion of the executive branch that spying is lawful. So, in other words, it's a violation of separation of powers if you're not going to allow the courts to determine whether the executive branch has overstepped its power in this kind of massive wiretapping operation. Okay, so we had one other case that I'll just mention briefly, which is has to do with the issuance of national security letters. So how many people have ever heard of national security letters? Okay, so an NSL is like a secret letter that the FBI can send generally to information providers like libraries to ask them for information about one or hundreds or thousands of users. And so the thing about national security letters, this is part of the Patriot Act, is that if you receive one, you're not allowed, there's a gag order attached to it, so you're not allowed to talk about the fact that you've received this request for information. So the Electronic Frontiers Foundation and the ACLU believe that there are like hundreds of thousands of these letters that have been issued, but few people speak up about them, and we have no idea how many have been complied with. But every now and then someone decides to contest a national security letter, and this was in fact the case with a group called Internet Archive, which is based in San Francisco. It's a digital archive run by a fellow named Brewster Kahle. And so Brewster Kahle often also happens to be on the board of the Electronic Frontier Foundation. So he got this national security letter, and he decided to challenge it, and the ACLU and EFF worked together to do that. And basically, we reached a settlement with the FBI that said that agreeing to the unsealing of the case and finally allowing Brewster to kind of speak out about it. And then the demand for the information was rescinded. So we only know of a few cases where these national security letters have been challenged, but we've won every time. So there's kind of like some hope that that there's that they won't be around much longer, or that there's at least a lack of will at the federal level to try to reestablish the authority of these national security letters. Okay, so I think I'm about out of, is it 1 second? 0, okay. So, so anyway, I'll just leave it there. So thank you for the opportunity to share all this with you.